So Lisa, a very warm welcome to our Spotlight on Medical Science Liaison session, and thank you so much for agreeing to talk to us about your career path from your research in cancer research and in academia and your move into industry. Before we learn a bit more about your role in Medical Science Liaison, we know our audience will be really keen to hear a bit more about how you made your way from your PhD in medical sciences that you did at Cancer Research UK to your current role. So could you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more about your journey?
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. So I did my PhD, as you just said, at the CRUK CI in Cambridge in cancer research, focusing on like very translational cancer research in pediatric neuro-oncology, and then went on to do a postdoc at the German Cancer Research Center, still very translational, really interesting in looking into circulating tumor cells. But then I realized that I would be interested in pursuing a different path, and then I started looking into what other options there were that allowed me to kind of use everything that I've learned during my PhD and my postdoc in my then future role, and ended up as a medical science liaison, abbreviated as MSL, at Jazz Pharmaceuticals, which is like a global biopharmaceutical company and has a focus not only in oncology but also in neuroscience. So yeah.
That's great, thank you. And in your bio that you provided, you described your role as translating complex scientific concepts into actionable insights for healthcare professionals and fostering meaningful relationships between the scientific and medical community and the pharmaceutical industry. Could you tell us a bit more about why that relationship between the scientific and medical community and the pharma industry is so important and on all sides, and perhaps what you feel the impact is of the work that you do?
Absolutely, yeah, thank you for that question. I think that is great because when I started, and even beforehand, when I looked into what the role would entail, I was quite interested in being like the scientific bridge, basically, between the pharma company and the medical community. And I think for me personally, what's most important is being able to not only learn a lot about the scientific and medical data that come out of the clinical trials from our company and other clinical trials that are using our drugs, but then also taking that knowledge and discussing that with very important healthcare providers. So basically ensuring that they have all the knowledge that they need regarding data from clinical studies, so that they know where the drugs are working, what the perfect patient population would be to use the drugs, but also what kind of patient population would not be the right one to use the drug in. So it's very unbiased communication. And I think that's what really, what's really interesting and what really interested me.
Excellent, thank you. So just to help people to better understand what your role entails, could you walk us through perhaps a day or a week in the life of your job and the kinds of things that you're getting involved with day to day?
Absolutely. I think when I thought about this beforehand, a day in the life, specifically for the MSL, luckily, or at least that's my perspective, luckily not every day is the same. So there's a lot of variety, but like looking at the week, for example, you would be maybe going to a congress where you would attend sessions, you would meet up with the key opinion leaders in the field wherever you're based in. You would also you have a specific region assigned to you within your within your company as an MSL, where you travel around and start building up relationships and also maintain these relationships with these key opinion leaders, so basically healthcare professionals that are treating the patients. So you would also be traveling, within your country or your region to meet up with them. You would be educating yourself on new clinical or scientific data, or you'd be educated. So we also have a lot of internal trainings, for example. So there's continuous learning. And I think the focus is on relationship building, continuous learning. You have to be up to date with data. Yeah, and then there's lots of other interdisciplinary projects that you could be involved in within your firm, for example. I think that would sum up a week. So there's lots to do.
Yeah, it sounds like a great varied role for those who really like that variety. And what would you say is the most rewarding aspect of your work?
I think most rewarding for me would be when discussing, data with clinicians, hearing patient success stories. So hearing from patients that have been treated with our drug and that have really, been successfully treated. We have very innovative drugs, for example, and then, learning that these actually make an impact into the patient's life. I think that's most rewarding.
Right, I certainly think that will reflect with some people who want to understand the impact that their science is having. So it's always good to know there are roles where you get to hear about it and you get to see it in action, which is great. And I guess on the flip side, what do you feel is potentially one of the most challenging aspects of your role?
I think the most challenging is definitely staying up to date with all the data. So specifically, oncology is a very rapidly changing field when you think about treatment landscapes or how tumors are being characterized. I mean, luckily, there's a lot happening, but that's definitely challenging to keep up to date with all the information that is constantly being published. And I think for me specifically, something that's not very specific to the role, but also genuinely coming out of COVID, because I kind of transitioned into my role in 2023. So everyone was very used to doing home office, and it felt not very different to what I had done before, but not being able to have an office that I go to every day, apart from the days when I'm traveling, that sometimes feels a bit challenging, I think. But then I try and make up for it and just talk to my colleagues via Teams or Zoom or on the phone, just to keep up with them, I think. That's
So it sounds like being proactive and reaching out to colleagues is kind of an important thing for you to help you stay connected. Yeah, and I'm sure that's really useful for people to hear when they're thinking about perhaps moving away from being in the lab 5 days a week, for example. It's quite a transition, isn't it? And thinking about your work, what would you say are some of the most important skills and attributes for someone working in medical science liaison to have? And perhaps could you explain why some of those skills and attributes are important as well?
Yeah, definitely. I think the scientific expertise really helps a lot and is really important, but you don't necessarily have to have a background, in the field that you kind of enter into. I think being able to kind of work yourself into a new topic, everything that you learn during your PhD and maybe also even the postdoc, kind of getting a grasp of how the field works, the treatment landscape, for example, and also the tumors when it comes to oncology. I think you need to be able to work your way into this pretty quickly. But to be honest with you, everything that I've learned at Cambridge really helped me, also, which is something I learned during my postdoc. So any kind of strategic thinking, when you think about what you're doing in the lab, obviously you have to be really strategic about what kind of experiment comes next. But also analytical skills, you need those as well. When you have, a new set of data, you have to think about how would this impact, patients' lives? How would this impact how doctors are treating their patients, for example? Time management is a very important skill. Also something that you definitely need in the lab and that you definitely learned in the lab. And what I really value is that you're very independent as an MSL. So obviously you're dependent on dates for congresses, for example, and other kind of events that are happening, educational events. But when it comes to kind of scheduling your week, you can do this yourself. So you talk to your clinicians, your healthcare professionals when you set up dates with them for meetings, and you're very independent when it comes to this. I think this is something I really wanted to ensure I have in my future role, and I can definitely confirm that that seems to be the case. And then you need to want to continuously learn, because this is so important. I think if you don't have fun, doing that, then maybe, something else still in the pharmaceutical industry, but medical affairs specifically, it's all about learning continuously. And I think if you've done a PhD and a postdoc, this is something you're very used to, and that can be very fun. So the learning curve has been very steep since I started, which makes everything quite exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. Would you mind just elaborating a bit on that learning curve and how you found it moving from academia into industry, and perhaps how you've tackled it a little bit?
Yeah, a good point. So I think I just tried leveraging everything I had learned of how to approach, learning about new fields. I personally try to be very structured, so I always need to have an overview of what I have to learn, what I've already learned, and what may be to come. And I try and kind of reorganize whenever something new comes up. I try and reorganize my information. I use several different tools to do that. And I think, but this is definitely something I've already learned during my PhD, for example. As probably everyone, different projects, and then you have to, and they may be in different kind of fields of topics. So you have to organize yourselves within those. I think, what really helped me was to have a strategy, kind of setting my own deadline. Also, you'll also have external deadlines, but knowing how to approach this really helps. And I also leveraged a lot from writing up my PhD, because there you also, have to be very structured and set your own deadlines. So I think all of that really helps. Yeah.
Great.
Something I did forget though, when listing what's important, is relationship building. So because you're the kind of bridge between, your company and the clinicians out there, and everyone is different, right? Not just everyone within the team that you're working with, but also everyone outside of the company. So you have to approach every meeting slightly differently. There may be different needs from different hospitals, healthcare providers, so you really have to adapt to it. And you really, if you enjoy, building relationships with different people and enjoy networking, then this is definitely something you should consider probably.
Yeah, absolutely. And on that topic of kind of networking and relationship building, to what extent are you having to seek out those new relationships versus kind of nurturing those contacts and communities that you're already a part of, or that the community is already a part of?
That's a very good question. I think that really depends on also your company, how big your region is, for example, and also how the field that you're in changes rapidly. So I think I was quite lucky, and I got into a region where there were a lot of educational events, for example. So it was like easy to get in contact with important healthcare providers, for example. But there's definitely a big dynamic. So, it's probably a mix of acquiring new contacts and starting up new relationships, and maintaining those that you've already built.
Yeah, that's really helpful and gives a good insight into the nature of your work as well. So that's great. Thank you. And I guess now you've been working in this role for a little while, what's one thing you know now about medical science liaison work that wasn't clear or obvious to you before you started?
I think that's a very good question. I thought about this beforehand, and I think for me, it's the amount of travel, but it's very kind of, I also love traveling. So it's more than I expected, which makes me really happy. So I think this is definitely something, yeah, that I didn't know beforehand, that there was a lot of travel, and I got really lucky. I got to travel internationally as well, which I enjoyed very much. So I got to meet international colleagues, got to attend international conferences. So that really, yeah, I really enjoyed that very much. And I think something else is, again, of you're not meeting your colleagues every day, even though you know this beforehand. Maybe, you know, it's very different when you then enter the role and everyone is scattered throughout the country, for example. And you know, if you have lovely colleagues, you want to see them as much as possible. So yeah, I think this is something that I sometimes yeah, try and work on by just compensating it with calls.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for those who really enjoy the travel aspect of academic research and going to conferences, it's nice to hear that there's quite a lot of overlap with some of the things people often find quite enjoyable about the academic context as well. So it's nice to be able to know that you can keep some of those things when you move away from the research.
Definitely. I think I had very fruitful and exciting scientific discussions with a lot of healthcare providers. I was really ecstatic, to be honest, for the first 6 months, because everything was new, and I didn't expect it to be so scientific. So I think that was a very pleasant surprise. Yeah.
Oh, that's a great surprise to share with us. I think that's a really positive thing to hear. If people are starting to think about this career area, have you got any advice for people who are just starting to consider medical science liaison as a potential career area, perhaps about how to explore it or to learn a little bit more about it?
That's a very good question. I think what I would suggest is reach out to people that are already working in the field. I had a very lovely colleague from my Cambridge lab, actually, and she had moved into the field of medical affairs and was an MSL while I started looking for jobs and interviewing. So it was really nice to talk to her, to also kind of manage expectations on my side,
Yeah.
and kind of get a feeling of, you know, what would be expected. I think it's also important. It might differ from country to country, what that role entails, and obviously also from company to company. So if you know anyone that is MSL, definitely try and reach out. I think someone suggested to me, that was even before I started looking into MSL roles, if you find someone on LinkedIn that is having the exact career track that, you know, you want to pursue, it doesn't hurt trying to reach out to them and contact them and ask them, you know, if they would share some of their insights, and if they have any tips. So I think that's definitely something I would suggest. If you know anyone in the company, try and connect with them. And I would also say definitely think about what kind of field you want to go into, because you can be an MSL in any kind of, you know, medical field. For me, it worked out really well going into oncology, and I've loved that very much because everything I've learned beforehand, I can somehow leverage. So I think if that is important to you, then yeah, definitely try and think about what kind of area would be most interesting for you.
That's some really good advice, particularly about not being afraid to reach out. And it's great that you found that particularly helpful as well, because I know some people are a bit reluctant to cold email or cold message on LinkedIn, but it's reassuring to hear that is something you've done and it's worked positively.
I think alumni, you know, talking to alumni also always helps. If you have someone in like the Cambridge alumni, society, or wherever you've worked after that or before that, if you know anyone, definitely it does not hurt reaching out to them.
Good tip, thank you. And what advice might you have, or might you give for those who are sure that they want to work in this area, or and are kind of in the midst of job hunting, making applications, and having job interviews as well? Have you got any tips for that, though, people at that stage?
Good question. I think what worked out really well for me was showing how I communicate on a scientific basis, because that's what it's mainly about, right? You have to communicate very clearly, and this is something that you definitely learn during your PhD and postdoc. So you can leverage that and, you know, ensure that they know that you're very good at communicating scientific data. You kind of, I had some, during my interviews, for example, I had some tasks that I had to, you know, to do. And then it was all about how quickly do you understand scientific data? How can you summarize it? So that's definitely something that I was also taught at Cambridge, how to summarize it in short, you know, in short sentences. So that's definitely something that I would focus on. And don't be afraid, you know, if you haven't had any experience in the field, even though I know many of the descriptions say you should have experience, but there's a lot of transferable skills that you learn during your time. And don't be ashamed to kind of stress that.
Yeah, absolutely. A common thing I hear, particularly from postdocs, is I know I've got lots of skills doing research, but I don't know if employers will recognize those skills. But I think you're right, definitely leverage those transferable skills and all of those things you mentioned earlier about communication and relationship building and time management and being able to learn. There's lots of things that you've already mentioned that people can hopefully recognize in themselves as they're listening to you as well. Great. And I guess the final question for me is, have you got any kind of other final pieces of advice, tips, or words of wisdom for those who might be exploring or thinking about a career in the life sciences industry more broadly, or in medical science liaison more specifically?
Yes, I think, I mean, it's an amazing field. I personally enjoy it very much. I think for me, it was very nice to realize that everything I have learned so far, I can somehow use and not just leverage, but use it on a day-to-day basis. And it's not just, you know, the scientific knowledge that is often also just very transferable. There's also other kind of transferable skills. I think if you're looking into this area, then if you enjoy networking, and I mean, Cambridge is a perfect place to do this, to learn how to network. So if that's something that you enjoy, you might also really enjoy, you know, working as an MSL, because that's really also what it's all about. You can, you know, you have to build these relationships with external experts, but you can also do a lot of networking within your company with other companies. Is really, the field is really nice. If you're attending conferences, for example, you definitely also meet a lot of other MSLs from other companies, and after a while it starts being really nice if you know, you get to know them, and then you get to have a little chat. I think what I also really enjoyed was the teamwork. So and that again is probably very dependent on how the company is set up, but we get to work in really nice teams. We have lots of interdisciplinary work, which I really enjoy. So yeah, if you enjoy that, then this is probably something that you would enjoy as well, working with people. And people have so many amazing skills, like different skills, and it's so nice if you're coming together as a team and it really works as a puzzle and everyone kind of just complements each other. I think I realized we have a very nice atmosphere. For example, it's a really nice working atmosphere. What really surprised me is not the correct word, but what I thought was really interesting is everyone has such a high drive. And this is something, you know, that in Cambridge again, you had that I had that with everyone that I met. during my time at Cambridge, everyone had such a high intrinsic drive, and I think this is something I find as well. So it's a really nice environment to be in. People are really motivated, and I think that's very inspiring as well. And generally talking about inspiration and innovation, yeah, the field, I mean, specifically being in oncology, obviously, where there's so much happening and so many new techniques and diagnostics are coming out every year, which is so exciting. I think it's just a great environment to be in, and it feels like you actually may be impacting the patient's life somehow. So
it's great to hear you speak so positively about your work and the kind of community of people working in the industry as well. That's, I'm sure, really reassuring and helpful for others to hear about as well. So thank you. Lisa, thank you so much for sharing your time, experience and insights with us for this Spotlight On session today. We're really grateful to you for taking the time to share your career story with us. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. If anyone wants to reach out, I'm very happy. As I said, you know, that also applies to me. If you want to reach out to me on LinkedIn and have any more questions, let me know. And thank you very much for having me. It was quite exciting to talk about, you know, transition into industry and into medical affairs.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you so much.